Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Imagine waking up to find out that the organization famous for bankrupting the Ku Klux Klan just got federally indicted for secretly funding them.
Yeah, it is a completely wild premise.
Right. Like you spend your whole life assuming the line between the good guys and the bad guys is drawn in permanent ink, especially when you're talking about institutions that basically serve as our societal moral compass.
Exactly. But today we are looking at a compass that is just spinning completely off its axis.
It really is. So we're talking about the Southern Poverty Law Center. This is an organization sitting on a staggering, $700 million endowment.
Which is massive.
Huge. And suddenly they're facing a massive federal indictment for allegedly funneling over $3 million to informants operating deep within neo-Nazi and white supremacist organizations.
It fundamentally breaks how we understand civil rights advocacy, and really the entire ecosystem of nonprofit intelligence gathering. Because the mechanics of what they're accused of doing and how the government is trying to prosecute them, it reveals this massive gray area in our legal system and our political landscape.
Which is exactly what we are here to unpack for you in this custom-tailored deep dive. So we're tearing into the April 2026 Department of Justice indictment against the SPLC.
Yeah, we're going to look right under the hood at the exact mechanics of their alleged covert funding scheme.
Yep, and examine the very real, highly technical, legal unforced errors the DOJ might have actually made in their prosecution.
Right. The DOJ might have really stumbled here. Plus, we have to look back at the years of severe internal fractures that kind of, set the stage for this exact moment.
Definitely. But hey, before we jump in, given that our sources today involve neo-Nazis, a left-wing civil rights giant, and the Trump administration's Department of Justice, we need to be crystal clear with you up front.
Yes, very important.
Our job today isn't to play judge or jury. We're not endorsing any political framings. We're not taking any sides. We are strictly here to look at the architectural blueprints of this case, to see what is actually happening beneath all the political shouting.
Exactly. We're just mapping the terrain. And to really understand that terrain, you have to look at the immediate catalyst.
Right.
So on April 21st, 2026, a federal grand jury in Montgomery, Alabama, which, by the way, is the exact city where the SPLC is headquartered.
Oh, wow.
Right. They handed down an 11-count indictment against the organization.
And the charges, they sound incredibly heavy. We're talking about wire fraud, false statements to a federally insured bank, and conspiracy to commit concealment money laundering.
Yeah, that last one is the kicker.
It is.
Yeah.
I want to pause on that because when you and I hear, money laundering, we usually think of a cartel taking dirty drug money and running it through a car wash to make it look clean.
Right, the classic Breaking Bad scenario.
Yeah, exactly. But the SPLC's money was clean. They got it from regular well-meaning donors. So how exactly do you launder clean money?
That is a really great distinction. So what the DOJ is alleging here is essentially reverse money laundering.
Reverse money laundering.
Yeah. Instead of taking dirty money and making it look legitimate, the SPLC is accused of taking legitimate donor funds and deliberately breaking the chain of custody. So the money just becomes completely untraceable.
Untraceable when it goes to some of the most dangerous people in the country, right?
Exactly. Between 2014 and 2023, the indictment claims the SPLC covertly paid out over $3 million to informants associated with groups like the KKK, the Aryan Nations, the National Socialist Movement, and the National Alliance.
And, you can't exactly write a check with the Southern Poverty Law Center logo on it and hand it to a guy in the Aryan Nations.
No, definitely not. They'd never take it.
Right. So they had to create a buffer.
Precisely. The indictment alleges that to hide the true destination of these funds from both their donors and the banking system, the SPLC opened bank accounts using a series of fictitious unregistered entities.
Okay, let's unpack this because the names they chose for these entities are just wild.
Oh, they're so weird.
They didn't use boring corporate strings of numbers like LLC 459. They set up accounts under names like the Center Investigative Agency and Rare Books Warehouse and Fox Photography. It literally reads like a plot from a bad pulp spy novel.
It really does.
You're literally using a fake photography front to, stay out of the picture.
Yeah, the irony is thick there. But once the money was moved into those specific accounts, it was then distributed to the extremist informants through prepaid cards and electronic transfer.
They're using deliberately vague descriptors, right?
Exactly. Totally untraceable.
So they successfully break the chain of custody. The donor gives money to the SPLC. The SPLC moves it to Rare Books Warehouse, and Rare Books Warehouse buys a prepaid debit card for a neo-Nazi.
That's the DOJ's timeline, yeah.
But beyond all the spycraft terminology, there is one specific line item in this indictment that just feels like a total bombshell.
Oh, it is the single most explosive allegation in the entire document.
Right.
The Justice Department claims that roughly $270,000 went directly to an organizer of the deadly 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia.
I mean, just pause on that. $250,000 to a single organizer of one of the most violent white supremacist rallies in modern American history.
Yeah.
This forces a massive question for anyone looking at this. Why would a civil rights group with a $700 million war chest take that kind of existential risk?
Well, it brings us directly to how the SPLC is actually justifying this.
Right. What's their defense?
Their defense is entirely rooted in their institutional history. They maintain that this was a highly covert, long-standing intelligence-gathering operation.
Right.
They argue that, look, infiltrating these groups requires capital, and this program traces its roots all the way back to the shadows of the civil rights movement.
So they're saying it's necessary.
Yeah, in their view, this covert funding allowed them to gather incredibly valuable intelligence, which they then shared with law enforcement, including the FBI. They frame these payments as a necessary evil that actively saved lives.
And, I mean, if you think about the informant economy, there's a certain brutal pragmatism to that argument.
Oh, absolutely.
We have a quote in our sources from Joyce Vance. She's an Obama-era U.S. attorney in Alabama. And she defended this specific kind of intelligence work by pointing out that the people inside these terrorist networks are, quote, not choir boys.
No, they're really not.
They don't just suddenly experience a moral awakening and say, here's our mailing list. You have to entice them.
Right, because information in the criminal underworld is a commodity. And it's a commodity that costs money. Law enforcement relies on paid informants every single day to dismantle organized crime.
I get that. It's like a controlled burn in forestry. You start a small fire, you burn away the dry brush, and it prevents the entire forest from burning down later.
That's a good way to look at it.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Buying a floor plan from an informant is one thing. But if you pay an organizer $270,000 leading up to Charlottesville, are you just gathering intelligence? Or are you essentially bankrolling the exact extremist operation you are publicly warning your donors about?
And that is exactly where the Justice Department zeroes in on the perverse incentives of the nonprofit model.
Because it's a massive conflict of interest.
Huge. The intersection of the SPLC's private actions and their public-facing statements is just striking. At the exact same time, the SPLC was using Charlottesville as undeniable evidence of a rising white supremacist threat.
A threat they used to raise millions of dollars, by the way.
Right, to raise millions from terrified donors. At that exact same time, they were allegedly funding one of the primary architects of that exact threat.
It's just a staggering level of cognitive dissonance.
It is. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche actually summarized the DOJ's perspective really bluntly. He stated that the SPLC was, quote, manufacturing racism to justify its existence.
Wow. Manufacturing racism.
Yeah. The argument is that if the hate groups disappear, the SPLC's massive endowment stops growing. Therefore, they have a financial incentive to ensure those groups remain active and visible.
That is an incredibly heavy accusation to hurl at an iconic civil rights institution.
Absolutely.
But, as morally questionable as the SPLC's informant program might appear to the public, being a hypocrite isn't automatically a federal crime.
No, it's not illegal to be a hypocrite.
Right. So how exactly is the government trying to put them in prison for this? Because when you look at the actual legal mechanics of the DOJ's indictment, it turns out the prosecution might have severely stumbled coming out of the gate.
This is where the intricacies of white-collar prosecution become fascinating.
Yeah, total legal nerd territory here.
Right. So the DOJ made a highly scrutinized strategic choice in how they framed these charges. For 4 of the counts, instead of using the standard, widely tested bank fraud statutes, they chose to rely on a lesser-known banking statute that deals specifically with making false statements.
But according to the white-collar defense lawyers who were analyzing this case, the DOJ omitted a crucial, foundational element in their charging document.
Yeah, they missed a big step.
One former DOJ fraud supervisor literally called it a prosecution 101 error.
Right, because to secure a conviction under this specific statute, it's not enough to just prove that someone lied. Prosecutors must definitively prove that the defendant had the intent to influence a financial institution.
The intent to influence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the indictment explicitly says the SPLC knowingly made false statements when they applied for accounts under names like Fox Photography, but it completely fails to identify what specific action by the bank they were actually trying to influence.
So let me make sure I understand the mechanism here. If I walk into a bank and open a checking account for Rare Books Warehouse, and I give them my initial deposit, and the bank collects their monthly maintenance fees, the bank hasn't lost any money, right?
Right, the bank is fine.
The bank isn't bleeding capital because I used a fake name. So what does this all mean? Did the DOJ get sloppy? Or did they use this lesser-known loophole statute because they couldn't actually prove the SPLC intended to defraud the bank itself?
Well, the legal consensus strongly points to the latter.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Former DOJ attorneys are arguing that the government knows there was no intent to financially defraud the bank. The bank got its fees. So prosecutors are trying to squeeze a moral outrage through a very narrow statutory loophole.
Wow.
And their reliance on that loophole runs headfirst into a massive legal hurdle. It's a 2025 Supreme Court ruling called Thompson v. U.S.
Ah, the Thompson precedent. Because in federal law, the exact definition of a single word can dismantle a $3 million prosecution.
Absolutely. In Thompson, the Supreme Court had to clarify this exact banking statute, and they explicitly ruled that statements which are merely misleading are not legally the same as statements that are outright false.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so if you register a legal LLC called Fox Photography, even if you never take a single photograph, the existence of the entity isn't necessarily a false statement to the bank. It's just highly misleading about your day-to-day operations.
But wait, if you read the DOJ's actual indictment against the SPLC, they use those two terms as if they mean the exact same thing.
Yep, they do.
They actually charge the organization with providing false or misleading information.
Yes, and defense attorneys are just jumping all over that phrasing. They argue that by intentionally including the word misleading, the Justice Department is practically confessing that they cannot definitively prove the statements were legally false under that Thompson precedent.
So by trying to cover their bases with the word misleading, they accidentally gave the defense the exact ammunition they needed to get those specific charges thrown out.
Right, thrown out by a judge before a jury even sees them.
That's wild.
It makes those 4 counts incredibly vulnerable. Now, to be clear, legal experts do warn that the broader wire fraud charges, which center on the SPLC allegedly deceiving their own donors about where their money was actually going, those might have a much stronger chance of surviving to trial.
Naturally. And the SPLC is pushing back with everything they have, right?
Oh, yeah.
Interim CEO Brian Fair has publicly stated that these charges are entirely baseless. He claims the DOJ is being weaponized by the Trump administration in this targeted political effort to systematically dismantle civil rights organizations.
Which, frames this not just as a legal battle, but as a full-on existential political war.
Exactly. But to truly grasp the gravity of this indictment, we cannot look at it in a vacuum. I mean, you don't just have a perfectly healthy, fully functional organization that suddenly wakes up one morning and decides to route millions of dollars to neo-Nazis through a fake photography business.
Right. That doesn't happen overnight.
No. If we look at the SPLC's recent history, we see an institution whose foundation has been cracking and fracturing for years.
Yeah, it reveals a profound institutional decay. The internal and external turmoil directly preceding this 2026 indictment shows an organization that was, frankly, already in a state of rolling crisis.
Let's trace it back to March 2019. This was a catastrophic collapse of their entire leadership structure.
Yeah, the big purge.
Right. Their legendary co-founder, Morris Dees, was abruptly fired. And the sources note he was pulling in over $400,000 a year at the time.
Which itself highlights the immense corporate wealth of an organization supposedly fighting poverty.
Exactly. But his firing triggered this immediate domino effect. The president, Richard Cohen, stepped down. Their legal director, Rhonda Brownstein, resigned. The entire top brass basically vanished in a matter of days.
And you have to look at the mechanics of why that purge happened. A civil rights organization doesn't just fire its founder over a minor disagreement.
No.
The staff staged a massive revolt. They accused the deeply insulated leadership of harboring a highly toxic corporate culture.
Wow.
Yeah, Meredith Horton, a high-ranking African-American female executive, she resigned and sent this devastating internal letter citing a severe lack of respect and a failure of diversity.
And it wasn't just a failure of diversity. Leaked internal staff letters accused the SPLC's leadership of being complicit in literally decades of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and sexual harassment.
Decades of it.
The profound irony there is staggering. Here's an organization whose entire public-facing mission, their entire fundraising apparatus, is built on fighting for equity and civil rights.
Right.
Yet internally, their own staff was screaming that they were structurally failing at those exact metrics.
And that internal dissonance really shattered their moral authority among many of their own supporters. But the structural decay wasn't just limited to their HR department.
No, externally, they had huge problems too.
Right. They were facing mounting legal pressure over their primary product, their famous hate group designations.
Because for decades, the SPLC's hate map was the undisputed gold standard. If they put your organization on that map, you were socially and financially radioactive.
Oh, yeah. You lost your banking, you lost your platforms.
But eventually, the groups being labeled realized they could fight back in federal court. So the SPLC started getting hit with major defamation lawsuits from entities like Coral Ridge Ministries Media.
Right. They sued after being banned from the Amazon Smile charity program because of the SPLC's label.
Exactly. And the Center for Immigration Studies sued them too.
Now, it's important to note, in those specific high-profile cases, the SPLC actually won.
They did.
But the mechanism of why they won is crucial for understanding their legal reality. The courts ruled that because the organizations suing the SPLC were classified as public figures, the SPLC's labels were protected by the First Amendment.
Right, because to win a defamation suit as a public figure in the United States, you have to meet an incredibly high bar. You have to prove actual malice.
Exactly. You have to prove that the SPLC either knew the hate group label was objectively false when they applied it, or that they acted with reckless disregard for the truth.
Which is hard to prove.
Very. The courts determined that while the SPLC's opinions and methodologies might be highly debatable or deeply flawed or even entirely wrong, the plaintiffs couldn't legally prove that the SPLC acted with actual malice.
So they successfully used the First Amendment as a shield for their labeling process. But they couldn't hide behind that shield forever.
No, they couldn't.
Because sometimes the SPLC's compass pointed in such a wildly incorrect direction that they had no choice but to open their checkbook. And our sources actually include the execution documents from a massive settlement that proves it.
Yes. In 2018, the SPLC found themselves in an indefensible position. They had applied the label of anti-Muslim extremists to a London-based group called the Quilliam Foundation.
Oh, wow.
And specifically to its founder, Maajid Nawaz.
Which is just an astonishing error, considering Maajid Nawaz is a former extremist who literally founded Quilliam to dedicate his life to combating the radicalization of youth. The SPLC targeted the exact people trying to solve the problem.
It was a catastrophic failure of their intelligence gathering process. And the evidence against the SPLC was so strong that they didn't even attempt to fight it in court and risk a public trial.
They just folded.
They surrendered. If you look at the final executed settlement agreement, the specific details are incredibly stark. On June 13, 2018, SPLC President J. Richard Cohen signed off on a settlement agreeing to pay $3.4 million.
$3.4 million?
Yeah. And the very next day, June 14th, the document was countersigned by Maajid Nawaz along with Haras Rafiq, who is the chief executive of the Quilliam Foundation, and Dr. Mohammed Fraser Rahim, their executive director.
$3.4 million of donor money paid out to make a catastrophic defamation claim quietly go away. When you step back and look at this timeline, the narrative comes sharply into focus. You have the multi-million-dollar defamation settlement in 2018. You have the total collapse of their leadership in 2019 amidst allegations of decades of internal racism and discrimination.
Right.
And now you have a 2026 federal indictment accusing them of using fake businesses like Fox Photography to funnel millions to right-wing extremists.
It just paints a picture of an institution that has been in a slow-motion freefall for nearly a decade, culminating in this unprecedented legal collision with the Justice Department.
And a Justice Department that, might have tripped over its own feet by charging them under a loophole statute where they confused misleading with false.
Yeah, the DOJ isn't looking perfect here either.
Not at all. It is a labyrinth of questionable ethics, massive financial incentives, and really complex legal statutes. And again, to reiterate to you listening, our goal today wasn't to declare anyone guilty or innocent.
No, absolutely not.
Or to validate the political claims made by either the SPLC or the DOJ. We just wanted to give you the blueprint of the facts, separate from all the political noise out there.
Because the facts themselves are far more complex than the headlines suggest. But, if we pull back from the legal mechanics of wire fraud and First Amendment protections, there is a much larger societal impact to consider here.
Yeah. What is the ultimate consequence of this?
Well, think about it. If an organization that has essentially served as society's primary compass for identifying hate groups loses the public's trust, who steps in to become the ultimate arbiter of extremism?
That's a great question.
And how will that vacuum change the way we define and police the boundaries of acceptable speech in the future?
That is exactly the thought we want to leave you with today. When the compass shatters, how do we agree on which way is north? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking at the mechanisms beneath the headlines, and we will see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.